When Rabbi Herbert S. Goldstein asked Einstein, "Do you believe in God?" Einstein replied, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." But who exactly is this God? Who is Spinoza? And what led him to redefine God in a way that became a watershed moment for free thinkers? A definition that stood against the cruelty of the Church, which once tortured Jews, writers, and Muslims who dared to challenge Aristotle's view of the world. So, let's talk about it. Knowledge of God is the mind's greatest good. Its greatest virtue is to know God. In 1632, Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam into a Sephardic Jewish family that had migrated from the Iberian Peninsula. He grew up in a world shaped by religious orthodoxy and mercantile enterprise. But Spinoza was never one to simply follow expectations. Instead, he embarked on a radical philosophical journey, one that would challenge not just Jewish tradition, but the dominant religious and metaphysical ideas of his time, especially to that of Christianity and Aristotle. Spinoza's intellectual rebellion unfolded in an era when Christian religious authorities held immense power. The Inquisition had forced his ancestors out of Portugal, and now in Amsterdam, he was expected to conform to rabbinic authority. But Spinoza questioned everything, seeking to understand the true nature of the universe and God. As he once wrote, "I do not know how to teach philosophy without becoming a disturber of the peace." On July 27, 1656, at just 23 years old, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Talmud Torah congregation of Amsterdam with a severe and irreversible writ of herem. Unlike others who had been temporarily exiled for financial or social misconduct, Spinoza's banishment was permanent and unusually harsh. He was condemned for his so-called abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, though at that point, he had yet to publish any of his philosophical works. His later writings, however, reveal the ideas that likely led to his expulsion. But excommunication did not silence him. He withdrew from the Jewish community and refused both threats and bribes meant to make him recant. Supporting himself as a lens grinder, a trade that connected him to the scientific elite of his time, he continued developing his philosophical ideas. One of his most controversial claims was his rejection of Jewish chosenness. He argued that the idea of divine election was not a metaphysical truth but a historical and political construct. He also dismissed religious law as obsolete, relevant only during the time of the Israelite kingdom. To Spinoza, true religion wasn't about rituals, it was about ethical principles, love and justice. In 1670, he published Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a book so controversial it was banned almost immediately. In it, he argued for the separation of philosophy and theology, defending freedom of thought in a world dominated by Christian religious dogma. As he deepened his understanding of nature and the universe, Spinoza set out to write his most ambitious work, the Ethics. Published posthumously, this book introduced a vision of God unlike anything before. Some have drawn comparisons to medieval philosophers like Avicenna, whose metaphysical work touched on similar themes. But the depth and precision with which Spinoza defined and explained God were entirely his own. Some called him an atheist. Others nicknamed him the God-intoxicated man. So, what was he? I'll leave that for you to decide. Drop your thoughts in the comments. But first, let's dive in and truly understand what Spinoza's God was all about. Whatever is in God, and without God, nothing can be or be conceived without God. Baruch Spinoza's vision of God stands in stark contrast to traditional religious beliefs. Instead of a personal deity governing the universe from above, Spinoza's God is the very fabric of existence, the one infinite substance from which everything arises. To fully grasp this, we first need to understand his concept of substance, a key idea in his metaphysical system. In philosophy, a substance is something that exists in itself and is conceived through itself. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence or intelligibility. Spinoza was challenging thinkers like René Descartes, who proposed a dualistic view of reality, mind and matter as two distinct substances, with God as a separate, independent being. But Descartes' dualism introduced a major problem. How could an immaterial mind interact with a physical body? Spinoza solves this by rejecting dualism entirely. He argues that there is only one substance, possessing infinite attributes. Two of these, thought and extension, are accessible to human understanding. This means that what we perceive as separate mental and physical realms are actually just different expressions of the same underlying reality. If multiple substances existed, they would either share attributes, making them indistinguishable, or have completely separate attributes, meaning they couldn't interact. Since interaction clearly happens, everything must be an expression of the same fundamental substance. Moreover, substances are by definition self-caused. So if more than one existed, they would depend on each other, contradicting the very meaning of a substance. Spinoza's conclusion? There can be only one substance, the infinite and necessary being he calls God or nature, Deus sive natura. This substance encompasses all reality, dissolving any distinction between the divine and the natural world. Since God is infinite, nothing can limit him. If God were finite, something external would have to restrict his existence. But since nothing exists outside of God, that's impossible. God is boundless, eternal, and exists necessarily, not by chance. Unlike finite beings, whose existence depends on external causes, God's very essence is existence itself. A world without God is inconceivable, because everything that exists is derived from God's essence. This is why Spinoza rejects the idea of a transcendent, personal God. God does not change, because change implies external influence or internal contradiction, neither of which can apply to an infinite being. If something external could alter God, then God wouldn't be the ultimate reality. Similarly, if God were divisible, then he would consist of multiple finite substances rather than an infinite unity. Since divisibility contradicts infinity, Spinoza insists that God is absolutely indivisible and unchanging. One of the most radical consequences of Spinoza's philosophy is his rejection of free will. Traditional theology portrays God as a free agent, choosing between different possibilities. But Spinoza argues that God does not make choices. He simply is. Since God is the cause of everything, all events follow necessarily from his essence. God doesn't decide to act. Everything unfolds with absolute necessity according to the laws of nature, which are simply expressions of God's eternal nature. This strict determinism applies to humans as well. Spinoza claims that our belief in free will is an illusion. We think we make free choices, but that's only because we don't fully understand the causes behind our actions. In reality, we are bound by the same natural order as everything else. Our desires, decisions, and thoughts arise from preceding causes within an infinite chain of necessity. Just as a stone, once thrown, continues moving unless stopped by an external force, human actions follow natural laws. Because all things derive from God, nothing can exist independently of him. To suggest otherwise would imply the existence of another substance, contradicting Spinoza's monism. Likewise, no mode, whether a human mind, a body, an animal, a tree, or a planet, can precede God because nothing can exist before the foundation of existence itself. Instead, all things are simply expressions of God's infinite attributes, unfolding necessarily within reality. Of the infinite attributes of God, humans can comprehend two: thought and extension. Because we are capable of thinking and conceiving ideas, Spinoza argues that thought must be an essential attribute of God. If it weren't, human thought itself would have no foundation. Since thought is an infinite attribute of God, all individual minds are finite expressions of God's infinite intellect. This leads to Spinoza's bold assertion that God is conscious, not in a personal, human-like way, but in a fundamental cosmic sense. The second comprehensible attribute, extension, means that the physical world is not separate from God, but an expression of his very nature. Spinoza challenges Cartesian dualism by rejecting the idea that matter exists independently of the divine. If God were purely a thinking substance without extension, the material world would have no foundation for existence. But because God is infinite, the attribute of extension must also belong to God, meaning that nature itself is divine. God is not beyond the world. God is the world. This brings us to Spinoza's most famous proposition, Deus sive natura, God or nature. This phrase is not a comparison, but an identity. God is nature, and nature is God. When we see a tree, we see God nature. When we pray to God nature. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, we see God nature. For Spinoza, this unity explains everything: God's omnipotence, omniscience, and our place in the universe. God does not act with intention, nor does he intervene in human affairs, because God is the totality of existence itself. This radical vision has profound ethical implications. If everything is one substance, then our relationships with others are not interactions between separate beings, but between different expressions of the same underlying reality. Spinoza's philosophy leads to a powerful ethical conclusion. We should love our neighbors because, in a very real sense, we are our neighbors. Just as mushrooms growing in different places are connected by a single underground mycelium, human beings are all expressions of the same infinite being. To harm another is to harm oneself. To love another is to affirm one's own nature. Hegel was a fan of his and said, "To be a follower of Spinoza is the essential commencement of all philosophy."